Tonight at 10, the weaker pound provokes a pricing war between the two corporate giants, Tesco and Unilever. Tesco is no longer getting deliveries of some big household brands and supplies are running out. It's thought that Tesco had refused Unilever's demand to raise prices across a wide range of goods by around 10%, a demand prompted by the falling pound. We'll have details of the pricing war and we'll be examining claims that this is part of the Brexit fallout. Also tonight, ministers say Parliament can't have a veto over the Brexit talks, as some MPs demand a much bigger say in Britain's future outside the EU.
We still have got no offer of a vote, and we need some clarity about the policy the government's going to pursue, because the government is accountable to this House.
A special report from a camp in northern Syria holding dozens of Europeans and their families who've abandoned so-called Islamic State. Some GP surgeries at risk of closure in England should be allowed to fail, according to a leaked NHS document. And we talk about the popularity of walking football, a low-impact version of the game for the over 50s.
In the South, obsessed with serial killers and school shootings like Columbine, the teenager who attacked her school friend with a knife is found guilty of attempted murder. And closing the floodgates, the rapid response team prepared for winter.
Good evening. The supermarket giant Tesco is at loggerheads tonight with Unilever, one of Britain's biggest suppliers of branded foods and goods. It's understood that Tesco has refused Unilever's demand to raise prices on a range of goods by around 10%. The demand was said to be prompted by the falling value of the pound following the EU referendum. Unilever has now apparently stopped deliveries to Tesco, and the supermarket is running short of a range of branded foods and goods. Our business editor, Simon Jack, has more details.
Out of stock, Marmite, Ben & Jerry's ice cream, Persil, some of Britain's best-known brands have been withdrawn from Tesco's website tonight as the UK's biggest retailer refused to accept a 10% price increase from the giant supplier Unilever. Retailers and suppliers fall out all the time, but industry sources tell me that this is of a different order of magnitude. The country's biggest retailer to fall out with its biggest supplier marks a new front in a perennial price war some say has escalated because of Brexit. This is Unilever's justification for the higher grocery bill. The value of sterling has fallen 17% against the euro since Brexit. That means Dutch company Unilever is seeing revenues from UK sales fall, so they're upping the price in pounds and pence to compensate.
We have seen the pound fall as a result of the Brexit vote, and obviously as a lot of food products are imported, this is putting pressure on suppliers, and eventually something will have to give, and we'll eventually may see some of these sort of cost increases coming through to actual prices on supermarket shelves, which will be bad for the everyday average sort of British consumer.
It was just last week that the boss of Tesco told the BBC that price pressures were building.
There are some pressures. Commodity prices, exchange rates will bring some pressure into the marketplace, and historically that has seen prices rise. But I stress our approach at Tesco is to work ourselves and with our suppliers to try and offset those pressures through productivity and other things so that prices don't rise.
Well, that working together appears to have stopped working. In a statement tonight, Tesco hoped the dispute would be resolved soon, but until then, shoppers may find a few items on their shopping list are missing.
Simon, can we just put some of this pricing row into perspective? Make sense for us of the kind of context of the falling pound and the Brexit uncertainty. How does that fit in?
Well, let me first say, Hugh, that it's not just Tesco who are having this problem with Unilever. All of the major grocers were hit with this price demand from the Dutch company. About 3.5 weeks ago, and they've been mulling out how to respond. And it's very interesting that Tesco have chosen to call their bluff, if you like, because Dave Lewis, boss of Tesco, used to work at Unilever. So no one knows more about their pricing and what the pressures are at Unilever than him. And I say call their bluff because a lot of the retailers are saying, look, there are price pressures here. Obviously, the pound has fallen against the euro and against the dollar. But some of this stuff is made in the UK. So trying to blame across-the-board price increases on the Brexit and on the fall in the pound is sort of trying it on. And what's going to be very interesting to see is how many of the other supermarkets who are going through the same process at the moment will either fall in behind Tesco or think to themselves, actually, Tesco not being able to stock Marmite, not being able to stock Purcell, it's a pretty horrible place for them to be. Maybe we'll let them sweat it out. So it's going to be interesting. But like I say, a lot of them saying, we acknowledge that there are real price pressures. We think the way Unilever has gone about this is wrong, but these price pressures are real and we may see more of it in the days and weeks to come.
OK, Simon, thanks very much. Simon Jack there for us, our business editor. Well, the Prime Minister has come under more pressure from MPs to allow a vote on her government's Brexit strategy. Labour insisted that Parliament had to be given the opportunity to vote on it before the UK begins its formal departure from the EU. But ministers insist that Parliament can't be allowed to have a veto. During a debate called by Labour, some Conservatives also expressed unease about the degree of parliamentary oversight. Our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, has this report.
Should MPs have the final say, Prime Minister?
Theresa May wasn't saying, but she knew the answer. She's in charge, and no one will block Britain's path out of the EU if she's got any say in it. The Prime Minister and her team mean to be the ones speaking for Britain. Government and MPs don't always face the same way. But MPs who say they accept the EU referendum have been told in the Commons they've no choice by the most Eurosceptic minister in the Cabinet.
What I'm not going to allow is any party to have a veto on the decision to leave the European Union. That is the first key decision.
Opposition MPs and some Tories want a say and a vote in deciding Britain's negotiating position as it leaves the EU. They were told ministers won't show their hand, and they had their orders from the voters.
Security terms, in control of our borders terms, in democratic terms, and in terms of the access to markets across the whole world, the European Union, and all of the opportunities we have outside. And the British people did vote for that, 17.5 million of them.
At question time, the Prime Minister again made clear trading with Europe may mean give and take, but EU migration would be controlled as part of an ambitious deal.
And that will include the maximum possible access to the European market for firms to trade with and operate within the European market. But I'm also clear that the vote of the British people said that we should control the movement of people from the EU into the UK.
The Labour leader mocked the absence of detail.
This is a government that drew up no plans for Brexit, that now has no strategy for negotiating Brexit, and offers no clarity, no transparency, and no chance of scrutiny of the process for developing a strategy.
The government is still working out its negotiating position and ministers are still divided. But most MPs never wanted Britain to leave, and many fear Brexit could harm the economy. There'll be many chances to vote before Brexit becomes reality. But by ruling out any formal opportunity for Parliament to approve or veto the deal, the government's staking not just Britain's place in Europe, but its own authority to govern on the outcome. From MPs on all sides who opposed Brexit and lost, persistent fears.
Nobody voted on the 23rd of June to take an axe to the economy or to destroy jobs and livelihoods.
Many people in the country don't think that there is a policy to put the national interest first. They think there is a policy to put people's narrow ideological interests.
You've got to take the country on this new journey with you. This cannot be the political equivalent of the country being put to sleep for 2 years in an anaesthetic and waking up in a magical new land.
This is a democratic process that will impact on our citizens to a significant degree and which should be subject to the most intense scrutiny of this place and the most intense scrutiny of devolved administrations as well.
But the victorious Leave side insist it's time to have faith.
The British people got it right, and it's our job to respect it.
Members opposite want to split us up by saying everything has to go wrong. If you wish to negotiate successfully, show confidence, show optimism.
MPs will have more chances to have their say. Brexit will take time, but negotiations are for ministers, and they'll stand or fall by the best deal they can get to take Britain out. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
So just to underline, the government says there won't be a vote on its negotiating strategy before the legal process of leaving the EU begins in March of next year. There will be votes on the Great Repeal Bill. That's the legislation to end the supremacy of EU law in the UK. That is promised for the Queen's speech next spring. And it is expected that MPs will have a vote on that final Brexit deal sometime in 2019. So let's talk to Laura Kuenssberg, our political editor at Westminster. And what do you make of the way that this pressure has been building on the Prime Minister for more oversight in Parliament, Laura?
Well, it doesn't seem right now, Hugh, that ministers are going to budge on this. Technically, they don't have to offer a vote at this stage. And in a sense, why would they risk something that would be an extremely serious defeat if they fail to get enough MPs on side? But I think there are two things that are really important, not just from today's debate, but a very similar rehearsal of the arguments that happened in the Commons on Monday. First of all, when it comes to this fiendishly complicated process of untangling ourselves from the EU, MPs are now clearly not just going to say, yes ma'am, 3 bags full to whatever Theresa May decides to do. And secondly, it's been really striking to see how senior MPs from the Labour Party, from the Liberal Democrat Party, from the SNP, and also some very well-known Tory faces are kind of collaborating on all of this to push the government, to call for more scrutiny, and frankly to send a pretty loud message to ministers that they just don't think it's good enough that they are sharing so very little of their intentions for how we get out of the European Union. So two very interesting markers have been put down, if you like, this week. Parliament is going to be running at high volume. In a sense, it's got its mojo back. There's a sense on the green benches that MPs feel this is a huge moment and they are absolutely determined that they will have their say by hook or by crook. But you know, it's also important to remember we're in the foothills here of a process. This is going to be like climbing a whole range of mountains, and the big moves, the big power plays in how we actually leave the European Union are months and years away. And the mood in Parliament, the mood in the public, and the mood around the whole continent might feel very, very different by the time we actually get to those crunch moments.
All right, Laura, thanks very much again. Laura Kuenssberg there with her thoughts at Westminster tonight. Well, the Russian government has expressed anger at the call for protests outside its embassy in London because of its role in the Syrian conflict. The Russians were responding to comments made yesterday by the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson. The Kremlin said that Britain had a duty to guarantee the safety of Russian diplomats on its soil. Our diplomatic correspondent, James Robbins, has more details.
Russian television has been full of the story. News of Boris Johnson's verbal assault in the Commons on Russia's bombing, including the destruction of a UN aid convoy, as well as his call for demonstrations outside the Russian embassy in London. Moscow denounced his words as Russophobic hysteria and used images from the archive to ridicule the Foreign Secretary. In London, Jeremy Corbyn's spokesman suggested protesters against atrocities heading for the Russian embassy might equally go to the American embassy. That angered many at Westminster, including some Labour MPs. Apart from a lone protester, there's no sign of demonstrators answering Boris Johnson's call and massing here outside any of Russia's embassy buildings in Kensington. But behind the exchange of harsh words between London and Moscow, there lies a brutal political reality. Western governments are all but impotent in the face of Russian military action in Syria. Humanitarian appeals to stop the bombing of Aleppo are having no effect. The UN predicts rebel-held areas in the eastern part of the city will be totally destroyed by the end of the year. But calls for a no-fly zone to prevent the bombing are widely questioned. Critics stress that risks direct confrontation between Russia and the United States. In Aleppo itself, and these are some of the latest pictures, an estimated 250,000 civilians face death and starvation, 100,000 of them children. Britain's former spy chief is blunt. He does not see how NATO forces can impose a no-fly zone.
You cannot pursue humanitarian goals in Syria and in the process risk confrontation between the United States and Russia. That is just a gamble which we cannot afford to take.
Which leaves President Putin calling the shots in Syria. Today he blamed President Obama and the West for the war.
It is very difficult to engage in dialogue with the current American administration. The administration formulates its needs and insists that they be met. This is not dialogue. This is diktat.
Tonight there is news that Russia and the United States will talk about Aleppo at the weekend, the first attempt to repair total breakdown. But their opposing positions look very hard to reconcile. James Robbins, BBC News.
The BBC has had exclusive access to a secret internment camp for former so-called Islamic State militants and their families in Syria. Some 300 defectors and captured fighters are being held at the camp, which is operated by a rebel group. Among those captured are French, Dutch and Polish nationals. Our Middle East correspondent, Quentin Somerville, has the story.
Where do jihadists go when their beloved Islamic State starts to crumble? Some are being held here at a secret camp in northern Syria. The men are from Europe, across the Middle East and Central Asia. They're defectors and prisoners of war, so few want to show their faces. In retreat, many have brought their families with them. In the headscarf is Abu Sumail. He joined the so-called Islamic State from Holland. Now a captive, he renounces the group.
They use people like human meat. You give your life to them, so they're going to start to take control of your life. I know I will get into trouble, but this is what I choose, and I will pay the price. I hope I can get out soon and live my life normally.
These are Egyptians, Tunisians, Holland. The camp is run by the rebel group Jaish al-Tahrir. Its commander showed me the details of dozens of prisoners. Some will be returned to Europe if the authorities promise to jail them, but others will face Syrian justice.
We refer them to courts and they rule according to the gravity of their crimes. If they had committed murder, then they might be executed. Some are jailed just because they still hold this wrongful ideology.
The Islamic State's core is collapsing. They're losing territory and an increasing number of people are attempting to defect. Joining IS was relatively easy, but leaving is difficult. It was hard, really hard, says this defector who was held at the camp. All of the borders have now closed. He's now left Syria. We've also learned that European intelligence agencies are on a mission in northern Syria to find, capture and return IS supporters. They're working alongside some rebel groups to create a kind of underground railroad which will bring IS group supporters home to face justice. For now, they're held in Syria, but these European jihadists want to come back. It will be a dangerous homecoming. Quentin Somerville, BBC News, Istanbul.
3 West Midlands police officers have been charged with perjury and perverting the course of justice following an investigation into the death of a man in custody in 2011. Kingsley Burrell, who was 29, died 4 days after being detained by officers under the Mental Health Act. A man has been jailed for at least 27 years for the murder of 15-year-old Paige Doherty in Western Bartonshire last March. The teenager was stabbed more than 60 times in what the judge called a savage and frenzied attack. John Letham from Clydebank murdered Paige after she stopped at his shop on the way to her Saturday job. Reports from Germany say a Syrian man suspected of planning a bomb attack has killed himself in prison. The reports say that Jaber al-Bakr was found hanged in a cell in the city of Leipzig. He'd been turned into police on Monday by 3 Syrian refugees after being on the run for 2 days. One of Britain's most senior police officers says he believes at least 100,000 men in the UK regularly look at obscene images of children online. The Chief Constable of Norfolk, Simon Bailey, says forces can no longer deal with the scale of the problem. His comment came on the day that a paedophile exposed by a BBC News investigation received a 4-year extended sentence. Our correspondent Angus Crawford has more details.
We're going to go to his address and arrest him.
A specialist police team have identified a target, a convicted sex offender.
He's continued to look at indecent images of children with some really concerning search terms on his internet search history.
His name is Nigel Fairey. He's taken to a police station in Northamptonshire for questioning. Other detectives seize his mobile phones and memory cards. On them, hundreds of indecent images of children.
He's been arrested in order to protect children and vulnerable people.
Fairey was arrested as a result of an investigation by BBC News. We discovered paedophiles were using secret groups on Facebook to share images and comments. Fairey had set up one called Schoolgirls.
clear he's taken the picture from his own jacket. Here's the zip of his jacket.
After his previous conviction, he wasn't even meant to have access to the internet. Today, Fairey was given a 4-year extended sentence. The judge said he was a dangerous man. But the truth is there are tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of other men just like him across the UK who view images of child abuse online. And the police say they're overwhelmed by the scale of the problem.
It's significantly in excess of the 50,000 figure that I believe was probably accurately assessed in 2013. I think it now goes significantly beyond that.
So is it possible that there are as many as 100,000 men in the UK regularly viewing obscene images of children?
Yes, I think that's a conservative estimate. I think it's probably a lot more.
So how can society best protect children from this kind of threat? Recent figures suggest 1 in 5 new obscene images found online have been made by young people themselves.
Anybody can take your photographs, anybody can find out about where you play.
That's why at this school in West Yorkshire, pupils have internet safety lessons from the age of 8 and 9, driving home the message that what they do online can have serious consequences in the real world.
When you're at break time, I'll ask you some questions about...
Nigel Fairey, convicted for a second time of downloading obscene images, back in prison again. A symptom of a problem threatening to overwhelm a system already struggling to cope. Angus Crawford, BBC News.
A film production company has been fined £1.6 million for an accident in which the Hollywood star Harrison Ford was crushed by a metal door on the set of the latest Star Wars film. The incident happened 2 years ago during rehearsals for Star Wars The Force Awakens at Pinewood Studios in Buckinghamshire. A leaked document seen by the BBC and Pulse magazine says that some GP surgeries at risk of closure in England should be allowed to fail and go out of business. A letter from an NHS official to managers and GPs in one region suggests that these practices could be left to wither away. But NHS England suggested it didn't agree with the comments and it's promised more money to support some practices. Our health editor Hugh Pym has more details.
They're at the heart of local communities. GP practices are at the front line of healthcare, but rarely a month goes by now without reports of closures. Dr. Dean Eggett is a GP leader in South Yorkshire. He says recruiting doctors is getting harder, patient numbers keep rising, and the job becomes ever more difficult.
The pressure on GPs at the moment is insane. GPs are really struggling to keep their head above the water and to be able to provide safe care for patients. It's not going too far to say that general practice is absolutely in crisis and on the brink of failure.
NHS England says around 1 in 10 practices are vulnerable, including those with recruitment problems. It set up a £10 million support fund, but nearly a year after the launch, hardly any money has been handed out. A note seen by the BBC, written by an NHS chief in the Yorkshire and Humber area, says vulnerable practices must either transform and deliver a quality service or be allowed to fail and wither by the system. We are no longer in a position to continue supporting practices, irrespective of their willingness or ability as a provider to transform appropriately.
A mixture of kind of health promotion stuff.
This GP at a practice near Huddersfield doesn't know if they're on the list. He does know budget cuts are possible, which might mean they have to close.
I cannot point to one example of something that somebody has done. I can see no new investment into our bottom line budgets. We are in an emergency. We are a sinking ship. You know, it is no good promising us a lifeboat in 3 or 4 years' time.
Patients at the surgery told me how they felt about the possibility of closure and having to go further for care.
There is a big worry that people will end up in these super surgeries where it will be difficult to get an appointment, and it's unlikely that you'll see the same GP twice.
This surgery to me represents a certain spirit. It's the heart of the community. I'd feel very angry, I'd feel frightened.
NHS England distanced itself from the comment about practices being allowed to fail. A spokesperson said, "We are reversing the historic underinvestment in general practice through a wide-ranging action plan, backed with £500 million to support struggling practices." GPs in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have called on their governments to invest more in general practice. It's a frequent refrain around the UK as the pressure across the NHS landscape continues to build. Hugh Pym, BBC News, Yorkshire.
Well, for the first time in over 30 years, Britain is to host cycling's prestigious Road World Championships. They'll be held in 2019 in Yorkshire, which 2 years ago successfully hosted the start of the Tour de France. But the news does, of course, coincide with the period of controversy over drug use in cycling, as our sports editor Dan Rowan reports now from Leeds.
It's a sight that's becoming ever more familiar. Just some of Otley Cycling Club's 500 members out on their daily ride this morning. The club has doubled in size in the last 2 years, evidence that Britain's now a cycling nation. And today, here in Leeds, came more good news.
The UCI Road World Championships in 2019 will take place in Yorkshire.
It will be the biggest sporting event in the UK in 2019. It rounds off a decade of great sport for the country, and for us in Yorkshire, having had the Tour de France in 2014, 2 editions already of the Tour de Yorkshire, to have this huge cycling event coming here cements us as one of the cycling capitals of Europe, so it's massive for us.
This is what helped Yorkshire beat competition from around the world. The millions that lined the streets for the start of the Tour de France here 2 years ago, proving a true passion for the sport.
2 years ago, the world's most famous bike race began right here in Leeds city centre, and now Yorkshire finds itself right at the heart of Britain's cycling revolution once again. But today's news comes amid a growing crisis which is affecting not only the country's top professional bike team, but also the sport's governing body.
First came scrutiny over Sir Bradley Wiggins and his therapeutic use exemptions for a banned steroid shortly before races to treat his asthma. Then came claims from former rider Jonathan Tiernan-Locke that a powerful painkiller was freely offered when he competed for Britain at the World Championships in 2012. And finally, it emerged a mystery medical package had been delivered to Team Sky in June 2011 in France on the day Wiggins won a race. Team Sky, Wiggins and governing body British Cycling all say that no rules have been broken, but a UK anti-doping investigation has now been launched into allegations of wrongdoing. The man at the centre of the controversy is British cycling doctor Richard Freeman, formerly at Team Sky. At the weekend, he was withdrawn from travelling to this year's World Championships, but I caught up with him in Manchester.
Can I just ask a quick question about the delivery you took in 2011, June 2011? What was in that delivery, sir? Can I ask you about Jonathan Tiernan-Locke's claims that you handed out?
To answer all questions, but I'm on the phone.
No, I know, but can I just quickly ask you about that delivery? The use of tramadol, which Jonathan Tiernan-Locke says was being handed freely around.
Another medal haul in Rio this summer reinforced cycling's status as Britain's most successful Olympic sport, but some senior figures now want change.
It's out of control how it's been handled. I mean, this year we've had one saga after another, and so you've got to look at the governance, and hopefully it's all going to get itself sorted out.
Tonight, the sport's most powerful figure gave his view.
In my time as British Cycling President, we insisted on the highest possible standards of integrity and anti-doping, and as I say, I will be surprised and disappointed if that's not continued, and let's see what this investigation produces.
For Yorkshire's cyclists, this is a movement gathering momentum, but for those at the top of the sport, the questions are set to continue. Dan Rowan, BBC News, Leeds.
Now, it's called walking football. It's a low-impact version of the game for the over 50s, and it's become so popular that the FA is now drawing up standardised rules for competitive matches. There are more than 1,000 clubs registered to play, and that is up from just 200 a couple of years ago. Our correspondent John Kay has been along to a game in Bath to see what it's all about.
It looks like football, it sounds like football, but watch closely. In the last couple of years, 25,000, mainly older people, have taken up walking football, making this one of the fastest growing but slower sports in Britain. For some of these men in Bath, it's the first time they've played in decades.
Kicking the ball again, especially these nice new balls they've got, you know. It's a new world.
It's nice to play again and meet new people. I'm slower and I'm older, but the passion for the game and the touch and the feel of the ball is still the same.
Just keeping fit and keeping the doctor away.
With the first Home Nations tournament taking place next month, the FA says it's time to clear up the rules.
People play just 3 touches, people play over the head, don't play over the head. So you need some sort of standardisation so you can play everywhere, because there's different leagues, or even around here, that you can play in different games, but all different rules. So it needs standardising, I think.
For example, some clubs say the ball must remain below head height, but what does that mean exactly? How do you decide what is walking and what is running? And should teams be in different leagues according to the age and fitness levels of the players?
There are a larger and growing number of people. We're going to play these games. Can we play them in structures and leagues and competitions? So therefore, the very heart of that is having a consistent set of rules to play to.
We've got guys who've had Parkinson, cancer, still suffering from cancer, knee replacements.
But Angelo says walking football should be about inclusion and flexibility, not rules.
But we don't want it to be too strict. At the end of the day, it's about getting people out of the house, meeting other people and have a game of football. It shouldn't be too standard.
The FA insists it doesn't want to put people off having an informal kickabout, but it does want to take walking football to the next level. John Kay, BBC News, Bath.
Quick reminder that Newsnight's coming up on BBC Two. There'll be more on the pricing war between Tesco and Unilever and also the latest on the US elections. Here's Emily.
A month today, America will have a brand new president. Tonight, after extraordinary new polling numbers, we take a proper look at the electoral maths and ask if a Trump win is possible. Join me now on BBC Two, 11 p.m. in Scotland.
That's Newsnight with Emily here on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.